The autumn sun cast long shadows across the rolling prairie of western Montana Territory, 1889. A lone figure on horseback crested the ridge, silhouetted against the golden light. Grace Kincaid surveyed her domain, 5,000 acres of prime grazing land that stretched toward the distant mountains. At 26, she'd built the Circle K into one of the most successful cattle operations in the region, earning her the nickname, the Cattle Queen of Bitterroot Valley. But today, she frowned at the sight below her. In the corral near the main house, a magnificent black stallion reared and bucked, sending ranch hands scrambling over the fence rails for safety. 3 years she'd owned that horse, and 3 years he'd resisted every attempt at training. The stallion, which she'd named Tempest for his stormy disposition, had become both her greatest pride and most stubborn challenge. Grace adjusted her wide-brimmed hat against the setting sun and nudged her mare forward. The men wouldn't be happy to see her. She'd already fired 2 professional horse trainers who'd given up on Tempest, declaring him unbreakable. But Grace wasn't one to accept defeat. Not when her father died, leaving her the struggling ranch at 19. Not when neighboring ranchers tried to force her to sell, and certainly not now. As she approached, her foreman, Henry Wilson, spotted her and removed his hat. At 55, with a weathered face and graying mustache, he'd been her father's right-hand man and stayed loyal to Grace when others doubted a woman could run a cattle operation. "Miss Kincaid," he called, "that devil nearly took Joe's arm off today. Might be time to admit some horses just can't be tamed." Grace dismounted, her practical riding skirt settling around her boot tops. Unlike many women who still attempted to ride side saddle, Grace had long ago adapted more sensible attire for ranch work, though she maintained proper feminine appearance with a shirtwaist and fitted jacket. "We're not shooting him, if that's what you're suggesting," she replied firmly, watching the magnificent animal pace the corral, muscles rippling beneath his glossy coat. "No, ma'am, but I got word there's a new fella over at the Anderson place. They say he's got away with problem horses. Some of the boys are calling him a horse whisperer." Grace raised an eyebrow skeptically. "Another miracle worker? What's his name?" "Xavier Northrup. Came from Wyoming Territory about a month back. Been taking on the worst cases around the valley." Grace considered this information while watching Tempest. The stallion had tremendous potential for breeding stock if he could ever be gentled enough to handle. "Send word I'd like to speak with this Mr. Northrup tomorrow," she decided. "Already did, ma'am," Henry admitted with a slight smile. "Figured you'd want to try everything before giving up on that beast. He'll be here at first light." Xavier Northrup arrived precisely at dawn, riding a dappled gray gelding that moved with remarkable responsiveness to his subtle commands. Grace observed him from the porch as he approached, tall and lean, with broad shoulders tapering to a narrow waist. His clothes were worn but clean, denim trousers, a faded blue cotton shirt, and a tan canvas jacket against the morning chill. His dark hair fell just below his collar, and a short beard framed a face tanned by years outdoors. What struck her most were his eyes, remarkably blue and watchful, taking in everything about the ranch as he rode in. He wasn't classically handsome like some of the sons of wealthy ranchers who occasionally came calling, but there was something compelling about his quiet confidence. Grace stepped down from the porch as he dismounted, removing his hat respectfully. "Mr. Northrup, I presume?" she said, extending her hand in the businesslike manner she'd adopted when dealing with men who often underestimated her. "Miss Kincaid," he replied, his voice deeper than she'd expected, with a slight rasp. His handshake was firm but not overpowering, a man secure enough not to need to demonstrate his strength. "Your foreman mentioned you have a stallion needing work." "I do, though needing work is putting it mildly. Tempest has thrown every man who's attempted to ride him and driven off 2 professional trainers." A slight smile crossed his face. "Then I imagine you've tried everything. Starvation, hobbling, exhaustion." Grace stiffened. "I don't approve of breaking a horse's spirit, Mr. Northrup." "Neither do I," he said simply. "May I see him?" She led him to the corral where Tempest stood alert, nostrils flaring at the stranger. The stallion's coat gleamed in the morning light, his powerful body tense with nervous energy. Xavier leaned against the fence, making no move to enter. He simply studied the horse, who stared back with equal intensity. "He's magnificent," Xavier finally said. "Arabian bloodlines?" Grace was surprised by his immediate assessment. His dam was a purebred Arabian. Sire was a thoroughbred. Xavier nodded. Speed and endurance. What's his story? I bought him from a cavalry officer heading east after the Indian campaigns. Tempest had injured him twice and was deemed too dangerous. I thought. She hesitated. I thought with patience he could become the foundation for a line of superior horses. Xavier continued studying the stallion. He wasn't always wild. Look at his eyes. There's fear there, not just aggression. Someone hurt him badly. Grace had never considered this. She'd assumed Tempest was simply born difficult. Can you help him? She asked. Xavier turned to face her, his expression serious. I can try, but I work differently than most trainers. It takes time, and I can't promise results. What do you charge? Room and board for me and my horse while I work with him. If I succeed, $20. The sum was less than half what the previous trainers had demanded, and they had required payment regardless of results. That's all, she asked suspiciously. I'm not in this for the money, Miss Kincaid. I'm rebuilding my reputation. Something in his tone suggested a story there, but his expression discouraged questions. Very well, she agreed. You can stay in the bunkhouse with the hands. Xavier shook his head. I'll need to camp near the corral. The horse needs to get used to me, day and night. Grace considered his unusual request. As you wish. You can set up in the small pasture adjacent to the corral. When do you want to start? I already have, he replied, his eyes returning to Tempest, who had not stopped watching them. That evening, Grace stood at her bedroom window, watching the small campfire where Xavier sat. He'd spent the day simply sitting on a stool outside Tempest's corral, occasionally reading from a small book, but mostly just existing in the stallion's presence. The horse had remained agitated for hours, but gradually settled into occasional curious glances at the silent man. It was unlike any training method Grace had seen. The previous trainers had immediately attempted to assert dominance, resulting in dangerous confrontations. Xavier hadn't even entered the corral. At supper, which she'd invited him to take in the main house, he'd been polite but reserved, answering her questions about his methods with brief explanations. Horses are prey animals, he'd explained. They survive by reading intentions. Most men approach with the intention to conquer. The horse feels that threat. And your intention? She'd asked. Understanding, he'd replied simply. Now, as she watched him by the firelight, Grace felt a strange curiosity about this quiet man. Henry had attempted to gather information about Xavier's past, but had learned little. He'd worked at several ranches in Wyoming territory, always successfully with the horses, but never staying more than a few months. Before Wyoming, his history was unclear. Grace prided herself on her judgment of character, a necessary skill for a woman running a large ranch. The cowboys respected her because she was fair but firm, never allowing any liberties despite being unmarried and relatively young. She'd turned down 3 proposals, all from men more interested in acquiring her land than her companionship. Something told her Xavier Northrop was different from most men she'd encountered. There was no posturing, no attempt to impress or intimidate. Just a quiet competence that was, she reluctantly admitted to herself, rather appealing. By the 5th day, the entire ranch was buzzing about Xavier's methods. He'd finally entered Tempest's corral on the 3rd day, but instead of attempting to approach the horse, he simply sat on his stool, sometimes reading aloud from a book of poetry. The hands thought he was touched in the head, but Grace was fascinated. Tempest's behavior had changed noticeably. The stallion's constant pacing had subsided, and he occasionally approached Xavier, sniffing cautiously before dancing away. Xavier never reached for him, never made any sudden movements. On the 6th morning, Grace arrived at the corral to find Xavier standing in the center while Tempest gently nuzzled his shoulder. The sight was so unexpected she gasped, causing the stallion to start and move away. I'm sorry, she said quickly. Xavier shook his head. No harm done. He's beginning to trust, but it's fragile still. How did you do it? It's barely been a week. He ran a hand through his hair, which caught the morning light with hints of auburn. I let him choose to approach. Most men try to force horses into submission. It works with some, but a horse like this. He looked at Tempest with unmistakable admiration. He needs to be a partner, not a servant. Will you be able to ride him? Grace asked, trying to focus on the practical outcome rather than the way the morning sun highlighted Xavier's profile. Eventually, but there's something you should know about him. Xavier's expression grew serious. Someone used spurs cruelly on him. His sides have scars. That's why he throws riders. He's expecting pain. Grace's hand flew to her mouth. I never saw. I should have examined him more carefully. The scars are mostly hidden by his coat. You couldn't have known. Can he recover from that kind of treatment? Xavier nodded slowly. Horses forgive, but they don't forget. We'll need to show him that riding doesn't mean pain. Grace noticed his use of we, but didn't comment on it. What's your plan? Today I'll introduce a saddle blanket. Just let him see it, smell it. Nothing more. That seems. She hesitated, not wanting to offend. Slow. Xavier smiled slightly. It is. But lasting trust isn't built quickly. Throughout the day, Grace found herself drawn to the corral repeatedly, watching Xavier's patient work. By late afternoon, Tempest was allowing the blanket to rest briefly on his back before shaking it off. That evening, she invited Xavier to dine with her again. Her housekeeper, Mrs. Collins, raised an eyebrow but said nothing as she served the meal. Grace was well aware of the potential for gossip, but as the ranch owner, she could extend such invitations without significant scandal, particularly as Mrs. Collins remained in the house as chaperone. Tell me, Mr. Northrop, where did you learn your methods? Grace asked as they ate. They're unlike anything I've seen. Xavier seemed to consider his answer carefully. I spent some time with the Cheyenne years ago. They have a different relationship with horses than most white men. You lived among Indians? Grace couldn't hide her surprise. The Indian Wars had officially ended, but relations remained tense throughout much of the West. For nearly 2 years, I was wounded during my service in the cavalry. A Cheyenne family found me and healed me. You were a soldier? This explained his straight posture and disciplined manner. Briefly, I was young and thought it was my duty. His tone suggested the experience had changed his perspective. And after the Cheyenne, I worked wherever I could find employment. Most ranchers want their horses trained quickly, not properly. I don't stay where I'm pressed to use methods I don't believe in. Grace studied him across the table. You've sacrificed financial security for your principles. Some things matter more than money, Miss Kincaid. His blue eyes met hers directly. Grace felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with business. Please, call me Grace, she said, surprising herself. Then I'm Xavier, he replied with a small smile that transformed his serious face. Later, as she prepared for bed, Grace found herself reflecting on their conversation. Xavier Northrop was unlike any man she'd met, principled but not self-righteous, confident but not arrogant. And the way he worked with Tempest showed a patience and sensitivity she'd rarely observed. She reminded herself that he was her employee, here temporarily for a specific purpose. Getting too personally involved would be imprudent for a woman in her position. And yet, she found herself looking forward to tomorrow with unusual anticipation. 2 weeks later, Grace stood breathless as Xavier sat atop Tempest for the first time. The stallion was tense but not panicking, circling the corral at a walk, while Xavier spoke quietly to him. There was no saddle yet, just a blanket, and Xavier held no reins, guiding the horse with gentle pressure from his legs and occasional touches to the neck. The transformation in the stallion was remarkable. He still had moments of nervousness, but the wild fear had been replaced by cautious cooperation. More surprising to Grace was how the rest of the ranch had been affected by Xavier's presence. Several of the hands had begun adopting his gentler methods with their own mounts. The stable boy, Tommy, just 16 and previously terrified of the more spirited horses, had become Xavier's shadow, absorbing his techniques and growing in confidence daily. He's a natural horseman, Xavier had told Grace privately. He has the patience most men lack. As for Grace herself, she'd found increasingly frequent reasons to observe Xavier's work, and their evening conversations had become a highlight of her days. He'd revealed more about his past, his childhood on a small farm in Pennsylvania, his brief military service during the final months of the Civil War, his wandering years after living with the Cheyenne. In turn, she'd shared stories of taking over the ranch after her father's death, the struggles to be taken seriously as a female rancher, and her determination to innovate rather than merely survive. Most ranchers resist new methods, she explained one evening as they sat on the porch after supper. But I've been experimenting with rotating grazing pastures and introduced Hereford bulls to improve our stock. You're forward-thinking, Xavier observed. That's rare in this business. It hasn't made me popular with neighboring ranchers. They think a woman should have sold out years ago. Their loss, Xavier said simply. This is one of the best managed operations I've seen. His compliment warmed her more than it should have. Now, watching him guide Tempest around the corral with minimal direction, Grace felt an undeniable admiration for this quiet man and his gentle strength. When the stallion finally came to a willing stop in front of her, she couldn't help but smile broadly. "He's remarkable," she said, reaching out slowly to stroke Tempest's nose. The horse accepted her touch without flinching, another significant improvement. "He always was," Xavier replied, sliding carefully from the horse's back. He just needed someone to see past his fear. Something in his tone made Grace look up sharply. Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither spoke. She was acutely aware of his proximity, of the respect in his gaze that held something deeper, something that made her heart beat faster. The moment was broken by Henry calling from across the yard about a problem with the irrigation ditch. Grace stepped back, suddenly conscious of the hands working nearby. "I should see to that," she said quickly. Xavier nodded, his expression returning to its usual calm. "I'll continue with Tempest. Tomorrow we might try a proper saddle." As Grace walked away, she found herself unsettled by her reaction to Xavier. She'd always prided herself on maintaining appropriate distance from her employees, on being respected as a businesswoman rather than viewed as a potential wife. But Xavier stirred feelings she'd long suppressed in favor of building her ranch. That evening, she made an excuse to skip their usual conversation, claiming paperwork that couldn't wait. In truth, she needed to regain her perspective. Xavier would complete Tempest's training and move on, as was his pattern. Allowing herself to develop inappropriate feelings would only lead to disappointment. The following Sunday afternoon, with most of the hands taking their weekly leisure time in town, Grace decided to ride out to check on the western pastures. She was surprised to find Xavier already saddling his gray gelding outside the stable. "Great minds think alike," he said with a slight smile. "I was planning to explore some of the ridge trails, if that's permitted on my day off." "Of course," Grace replied, trying to ignore how appealing he looked in his clean denims and fresh shirt, his hair still damp from washing. "I'm heading to check the west pasture fences. The terrain is beautiful up that way, if you're interested in company." The invitation slipped out before she could consider its wisdom. Sunday rides with a male employee could certainly raise eyebrows, even for the ranch owner. But they would be in the open, on ranch business, she rationalized. Xavier's smile broadened. "I'd enjoy that." They rode out together, Grace on her reliable chestnut mare and Xavier on his responsive gray. The day was perfect, clear blue skies, moderate temperature, and wildflowers still dotting the grasslands despite the advancing autumn. As they climbed toward the ridge, Grace pointed out landmarks and shared the history of how her father had gradually expanded the ranch's boundaries. "He came here in '64, just before Montana became a territory," she explained. "He'd been prospecting without much luck and decided cattle was a more reliable future." "He was right about that," Xavier agreed. "Though I imagine it wasn't easy in the early years." "No, especially with the tensions between the gold seekers and the Blackfeet and Crow tribes. But father was fair in his dealings with everyone. He taught me that a reputation for honesty was worth more than quick profits." "A valuable lesson," Xavier said. "I've worked for men who believed otherwise." They reached a high point overlooking the valley, and Grace reined in her horse. Below them stretched the full expanse of the Circle K, pastures divided by creeks and stands of cottonwoods, cattle grazing in the distance, the ranch buildings tiny in the vast landscape. "It's beautiful," Xavier said quietly, his eyes taking in the panorama. "It is," Grace agreed. "Sometimes I get so caught up in the daily problems that I forget to look at the bigger picture." She turned to him. "Thank you for what you've done with Tempest. I'd nearly given up hope. He's exceptional. And so is his owner, if I may say so." The compliment hung in the air between them. Grace felt her cheeks warm despite the cool breeze. "That's kind of you to say," she managed. "It's not kindness, just truth." Xavier's blue eyes held hers. "I've worked for many ranchers, Grace. Few have your vision or integrity." Before she could respond, the crack of a rifle shot echoed across the valley. Grace's mare startled, nearly unseating her. Xavier was instantly alert, scanning the surroundings. "That came from near the north fence line," Grace said, regaining control of her horse. Another shot followed, and without discussion, They both turned their mounts and rode rapidly toward the sound. As they crested the next rise, they saw the source of the disturbance. 3 men on horseback had cornered a small herd of cattle against the fence. One was systematically shooting the animals while the others prepared to load the carcasses. "Rustlers," Grace hissed. "They're killing my cattle and taking the meat." Xavier assessed the situation quickly. 3 armed men. "We should ride for help." Grace shook her head. "By the time we get back, they'll be gone with half a dozen beeves. That's Henderson and his boys. They've been causing trouble along this border for months." Before Xavier could protest, she urged her mare forward. Drawing the revolver she kept in her saddlebag. Following her lead, Xavier kept pace, though his expression showed concern for her safety. As they approached, the men looked up in surprise. The oldest, a heavy-set man with a gray-streaked beard, cursed loudly. "This is private property, Henderson," Grace called out firmly. "Drop your weapons." The man laughed harshly. "Well, if it ain't the cattle queen herself. This here's disputed land, missy. These strays crossed onto my property. They're clearly on Circle K land, behind my fence which you've cut," Grace replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Sheriff Turner will be interested to hear about this." The 3 men exchanged glances, and Grace saw the younger 2 reach toward their holsters. Xavier moved his horse slightly forward, positioning himself partially between Grace and the rustlers. "I wouldn't," he said calmly, though his hand rested near his own holstered revolver. "Miss Kincaid is known for her shooting accuracy, and I rarely miss. Let's avoid bloodshed." There was something in his quiet confidence that gave the men pause. Henderson studied Xavier, recognition slowly dawning. "You're that ex-cavalry scout," he said. "Heard you was working hereabouts." Xavier didn't confirm or deny the identification. "We're riding back now. You gentlemen should do the same. Without the beef that doesn't belong to you." A tense moment passed. Grace kept her hand steady on her revolver, though her heart pounded. Finally, Henderson spat on the ground. "Ain't worth dying over a few cows," he muttered. "Let's go, boys." "But this ain't over, Kincaid." The 3 men mounted up and rode off toward the neighboring ranch. Once they were out of sight, Grace let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "That was foolhardy," Xavier said, though his tone held more concern than criticism. "They could have shot you." "They could have shot you too," she countered. "Ex-cavalry scout? Is that true?" Xavier's expression was unreadable. "For a time. After the war. You didn't mention that part of your military service." "There are parts of my past I don't discuss readily. They called me the Ghost Rider in those days. I could track anything across any terrain." His voice had a flatness that suggested painful memories. "I'm not proud of everything I did in that role." Grace sensed there was more to the story but respected his reluctance to elaborate. "Well, whatever your past, I'm grateful you were with me today. Henderson might have been more reckless if I'd been alone." "Does this happen often?" Xavier asked as they dismounted to repair the cut fence. "Occasionally. Some of the smaller ranchers have been hit hard by falling beef prices. Makes theft tempting." She worked efficiently with the wire. "I try to be understanding, but I can't let them steal from me. You're more forgiving than most in your position." "Father always said our success brings responsibility to the community," she explained. "I try to live by that, though some days it's harder than others." They worked together to mend the fence, their hands occasionally brushing, each contact sending an unexpected warmth through Grace. When they'd finished, Xavier helped her mount her mare, his hands strong and sure at her waist. The brief contact left her momentarily breathless. As they rode back to the ranch house, their conversation turned to lighter topics, but Grace couldn't ignore the growing awareness between them. Xavier had stood beside her against armed men without hesitation, revealing a protective nature that complemented rather than diminished her independence. Back at the ranch, as they unsaddled their horses, Grace made a decision. "I'm hosting a small harvest dinner next Saturday," she said. "Some of the neighboring ranchers and townsfolk. Would you join us? Not as an employee, but as my guest." Xavier paused, a brush in his hand. "People will talk. People already talk. One of the benefits of my position is that I can invite whom I please to my table." He studied her face, seeming to search for her true meaning. "I'd be honored," he finally said, a smile warming his features. Grace nodded, suddenly shy. "Good. 7 o'clock. Mrs. Collins makes an excellent apple pie." As she walked back to the main house, Grace acknowledged to herself that the invitation represented a turning point. She was signaling to Xavier, and to the community, that she viewed him as more than an employee. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. The harvest dinner was a tradition Grace's father had established years before, a way to maintain good relations with neighbors and celebrate the season's work before winter set in. Mrs. Collins had outdone herself with roast beef, chicken, and all the trimmings, while Grace had ensured the long dining table gleamed with her mother's china and silver. 8 guests had accepted her invitation, including the town doctor and his wife, the banker and his daughter, and 2 neighboring ranchers with their wives. When Xavier arrived precisely at 7, dressed in a clean dark suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly, Grace felt a flutter of pleasure at how handsome he looked with his hair neatly combed and beard trimmed. Mrs. Collins announced dinner, and Grace asked Xavier to escort her into the dining room, placing him at her right hand, a position of honor that didn't go unnoticed by the other guests. Conversation flowed easily, though Grace was aware of the speculative glances exchanged when Xavier spoke knowledgeably about cattle breeding or shared observations about Montana compared to Wyoming. "Mr. Northrop, I understand you've worked wonders with Miss Kincaid's unmanageable stallion," commented Mrs. Peterson, the banker's wife. "My husband says that animal was considered a lost cause." "Tempest just needed patience," Xavier replied modestly. "He's extraordinarily intelligent." "Grace has always had a soft spot for lost causes," remarked James Harrington, owner of the neighboring Diamond H Ranch. At 50, he was one of the territory's earliest settlers and had once proposed marriage to Grace, claiming their combined properties would create the largest ranch in the valley. His tone suggested he considered Xavier another of Grace's rehabilitation projects. "I prefer to think I recognize potential others, miss," Grace responded smoothly. Xavier's methods have transformed not just Tempest, but our entire approach to training. Several of our hands have adopted his techniques with remarkable results. "Interesting that you use his Christian name," observed Harrington's wife, Eugenia, with a pointed look. "One doesn't usually become so familiar with temporary employees." A brief, uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Xavier's expression remained composed, but Grace noticed his hand tighten slightly on his water glass. "Mr. Northrop has become a valued friend, as well as an exceptional trainer," Grace said firmly. "And I make it a policy to recognize skill regardless of its source or duration." Dr. Miller, always one to defuse tension, changed the subject to recent improvements in the town's school, but the undertone had been established. Grace was aware her interest in Xavier hadn't gone unnoticed, and the community would be watching closely. After dinner, the party moved to the parlor for coffee and Mrs. Collins' famous apple pie. The banker's daughter, Sarah, was an accomplished pianist and offered to play. As the music filled the room, Xavier found a moment to speak privately with Grace near the window. "Your neighbors seem concerned about my presence," he observed quietly. Grace sighed. "They're protective, in their way, and curious about anyone new, especially someone in my home as a guest rather than an employee." "Is that what I am now? No longer an employee?" His blue eyes held hers, and Grace felt the question went deeper than the words themselves. "You're completing the job I hired you for," she replied carefully. "But I think we both know there's more between us than a simple business arrangement." Xavier glanced around the room, aware of the eyes occasionally drifting their way. "I'm not a suitable match for someone in your position, Grace. I have no property, no standing in this community." "I didn't realize you were proposing," she said with a slight smile, though her heart beat faster at the implication. A flush colored his tanned face. "I'm not. That is, I wouldn't presume." Grace found his rare discomposure endearing. "I'm teasing you, Xavier. But I will say this. I've spent years building this ranch and my reputation. I've earned the right to choose my own associates, personal or professional." Before he could respond, they were interrupted by Dr. Miller's wife inviting Grace to join the ladies in discussing plans for the upcoming church social. The moment passed, but throughout the remainder of the evening, Grace was acutely aware of Xavier's presence, of the subtle glances they exchanged across the room. When the guests finally departed around 10 o'clock, Xavier was the last to leave. At the door, he took Grace's hand and raised it briefly to his lips, a gesture both proper and surprisingly intimate. "Thank you for including me tonight," he said. "It meant more than you know." Grace felt the warmth of his touch linger after he'd gone. Something significant had shifted between them, moving beyond the boundaries of employer and employee into uncharted territory. The question now was where this new path might lead. The following week brought the first snow of the season, a light dusting that would melt by noon but served as a reminder that winter approached. Grace stood on the porch, coffee cup in hand, watching Xavier working Tempest in the corral. The stallion now accepted a saddle and responded beautifully to Xavier's commands. Soon, there would be no reason for Xavier to remain. The thought troubled her more than she wanted to admit. In the months since he'd arrived, he'd become an integral part of her daily life. Their evening conversations had evolved into a cherished routine, revealing a compatibility of minds and values that Grace had never experienced with anyone else. Xavier looked up and noticed her watching. He smiled and waved, then guided Tempest toward the gate. As he approached the porch, Grace noticed how natural he looked on her property, as if he belonged there. "Good morning," he called. "Tempest wants to show you his progress." Grace descended the steps, setting her coffee cup on the railing. "He looks magnificent. You've done everything I hoped and more." He did the work. I just showed him the way. Xavier dismounted and held the reins out to her. "Would you like to try?" Grace hesitated. Though an accomplished rider, she hadn't mounted Tempest since acquiring him 3 years ago. "Are you sure he's ready?" "He trusts you. I've made sure of that. We've been practicing with your scent. I borrowed one of your scarves from the clothesline," Xavier admitted with a slightly sheepish look. "He associates you with safety now." Touched by his thoughtfulness, Grace took the reins. Tempest lowered his head, nuzzling her shoulder in greeting. With Xavier's steadying hand, she mounted the stallion, surprised at how calmly he accepted her weight. "He's so responsive," she marveled as the horse moved forward at her gentle command. "He wants to please you," Xavier said, walking alongside. "Just maintain confident, consistent signals." Grace guided Tempest around the yard, delighting in his smooth gait and willing turns. After a few minutes, she returned to where Xavier waited, his expression one of unmistakable pride in the horse, in her, in what they'd accomplished together. As she dismounted, their hands met, and neither pulled away immediately. The contact, simple as it was, seemed to communicate what words had not yet expressed. "Xavier," she began, uncertain how to articulate the feelings that had been growing between them. "Miss Kincaid," Henry's voice interrupted the moment as he hurried across the yard. "Telegram just arrived from Helena." Grace reluctantly released Xavier's hand to take the yellow paper. As she read the message, her expression shifted from annoyance to shock. "What is it?" Xavier asked, concern evident in his voice. "The territorial legislature passed an emergency appropriation for drought relief," she explained, still scanning the telegram. "They're holding a special meeting in Helena 3 days from now to determine distribution. As president of the Ranchers Association, I need to attend." "That's good news, isn't it?" "Yes, but the timing is difficult. We're scheduled to move the last herd to winter pasture, and with Henderson's increased activity along the north border." She frowned, mentally calculating logistics. "I can oversee the cattle drive," Xavier offered immediately. "The men know the routine, and I've helped with similar operations before." Grace looked up at him, appreciative but hesitant. "That's beyond what I hired you for." "Consider it a favor between friends," he replied simply. "You need to be in Helena. The ranch needs someone here you can trust." The fact that she did trust him, completely, despite knowing him only a short time, was remarkable in itself. Grace had always managed everything personally, reluctant to delegate important responsibilities. "Very well," she decided. "I'll leave tomorrow morning. The roundup should take 2 days, then 1 day for the drive to winter pasture. I should be back before you return." Xavier nodded. "We'll handle everything. Don't worry." That evening, as Grace packed for her journey, she found herself distracted by thoughts of Xavier. Their relationship had evolved into something neither of them had named, but both clearly felt. Her trip to Helena would give them both time to consider what might come next. Mrs. Collins knocked and entered with freshly ironed blouses for Grace's valise. "Mr. Northrop seems very capable," the housekeeper remarked casually as she folded the garments. At 60, she'd been with the family since Grace was a child and was the closest thing to a mother Grace had known since age 12. "He is," Grace agreed, keeping her tone neutral. Mrs. Collins gave her a knowing look. In my experience, a man who's good with animals and respectful to women is rare as hen's teeth, especially one who looks at you the way he does. Grace felt her cheeks warm. I don't know what you mean. Yes, you do. The older woman smiled kindly. Your father would have liked him. The simple statement touched Grace deeply. Her father's approval had always mattered to her, even years after his passing. The thought that he might have approved of Xavier meant more than she could express. He's just passing through, Grace said softly. Like all the others. Mrs. Collins placed the last blouse in the valise. Perhaps. Or perhaps he's been looking for a place to belong, same as we all do. With that gentle observation, she left Grace to her thoughts and the question that now presented itself. Could Xavier Northrop find his place here, with her, permanently? The journey to Helena was uneventful, though Grace found her thoughts repeatedly drifting to the ranch and to Xavier. The legislative meeting was scheduled to last 2 days, with various agricultural interests presenting their needs for drought relief funds. As one of the few female ranchers in the territory, Grace was accustomed to having to speak more forcefully than her male counterparts to be heard, but her reputation for fair dealing and innovative practices had earned her the presidency of the local Ranchers Association. On the evening of the first day, exhausted from hours of debate, Grace returned to her hotel to find a telegram waiting. Her heart jumped with concern until she read the brief message. Cattle drive completed, stop all hands, and stock safe, stop returning tomorrow, stop. Xavier relief flooded through her. The cattle were safely in winter pasture a day ahead of schedule, which spoke to Xavier's efficiency. She pinned a quick reply to be sent in the morning. Well done, stop meeting concludes tomorrow evening, stop returning day after stop. Grace, as she prepared for bed. Grace found herself contemplating the future more concretely than before. Xavier had proven himself not just as a horse trainer, but as someone who could manage the broader operations of the ranch. More importantly, he shared her values and vision. The question was whether he saw a future at Circle K, and with her. The next day's meetings dragged interminably, but finally concluded with a favorable outcome for the Ranchers Association. Grace would return with the promise of funds to help several of the hardest-hit operations weather the coming winter, a victory that would strengthen her position within the community. She decided to celebrate with dinner at the hotel's restaurant, a rare luxury she seldom afforded herself. As she was being seated, a voice called her name. Turning, she was surprised to see James Harrington approaching her table. Grace, I thought that was you. May I join you? Without waiting for her response, he signaled the waiter for another place setting. Suppressing her annoyance at the presumption, Grace nodded politely. As a neighboring rancher and fellow association member, Harrington was a necessary ally, despite his sometimes overbearing manner. James, I didn't realize you were in Helena. Last-minute decision. Heard about the appropriation and thought the Diamond H should have representation. He settled across from her, ordering whiskey from the passing waiter. Successful meeting, I understand. Yes, several smaller operations will receive much-needed assistance. Always looking out for the underdogs, he remarked with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Speaking of which, how is your horse trainer working out? The abrupt change of subject put Grace on alert. Very well. Tempest is fully trained now, and Xavier even oversaw our cattle drive while I've been here. Harrington raised his eyebrows. Quite a lot of responsibility for a drifter. You know, Grace, people are talking. People always talk, she replied evenly. I've never let that dictate my decisions. This is different. You invited him to your home as a guest. There are rumors about his past. Grace set down her fork. What rumors? Harrington leaned forward. Did you know he was court-martialed after his scouting days? There was some incident with a Cheyenne camp. Details are murky, but he was dishonorably discharged. The information hit Grace like a physical blow. Xavier had mentioned living with the Cheyenne, but nothing about a court-martial or dishonorable discharge. Could there be truth to this? I judge people by their actions toward me and mine, she said carefully. Xavier has proven himself honorable in every way. Has he told you why he never stays in one place long? Why he works for room and board rather than proper wages? Harrington pressed. A man with secrets isn't a man you can trust, Grace. Especially not with your reputation or your property. My reputation is my own concern, Grace replied, her appetite now gone. And I'd appreciate it if you'd allow me to enjoy my dinner in peace. Harrington held up his hands in a placating gesture. Just looking out for an old friend. You know my offer still stands. Combining our ranches would make good business sense, personal feelings aside. Thank you, but my answer hasn't changed. Grace signaled for the check, no longer interested in celebrating. If you'll excuse me, I have an early train to catch. As she left the restaurant, Grace tried to dismiss Harrington's insinuations, but doubt had taken root. Why hadn't Xavier mentioned a dishonorable discharge? Was there something in his past so shameful he couldn't share it? Even as they grew closer, Grace barely slept that night, her mind turning over possibilities. By morning, she had resolved to speak directly to Xavier upon her return. Whatever his past contained, she needed honesty between them if there was to be any future. The train journey back to Bitterroot Valley seemed interminable. When Grace finally arrived at the station, she was surprised to find Xavier waiting with the wagon rather than sending one of the hands as expected. "Welcome back," he said, taking her valise and helping her up to the seat. "Successful trip?" "Yes, quite," she replied, studying his face. He seemed the same trustworthy man she'd come to know, yet Harrington's revelations cast a shadow over her perception. "How did everything go at the ranch?" "Smoothly. The cattle are settled in winter pasture, and Tempest has been asking for you." He smiled as he guided the horses onto the road. "He recognizes the sound of your voice now." Grace wanted to enjoy their easy conversation, but the unasked questions pressed on her. Finally, as they approached the ranch, she could contain them no longer. "Xavier, there's something I need to ask you." He glanced at her, noticing her serious tone. "Of course. In Helena, I heard rumors about your military service. About a court-martial and dishonorable discharge." Xavier's hands tightened on the reins, his expression closing like a shutter. After a long pause, he spoke, his voice lower than usual. "Who told you this? Does it matter? Is it true?" He guided the wagon off the main road onto a smaller trail that followed the creek, a longer route home that would give them privacy. "Yes and no," he finally said. "There was a court-martial, but the discharge was later amended to honorable. It's a long story, Grace. I'd like to hear it. All of it." Xavier sighed deeply, then pulled the wagon to a stop in a grove of cottonwoods beside the creek. The late afternoon sun filtered through the few remaining golden leaves, dappling the ground around them. "I was a cavalry scout in 72 and 73, he began. Good at tracking, good at languages. I was assigned to a company led by Captain Wallace, a man determined to make a name for himself fighting Indians." Xavier stared out at the water as he continued. "We were tracking a band of Cheyenne who had left the reservation. Orders were to return them, by force if necessary. Wallace was brutal. He saw all Indians as the enemy, even women and children." Grace listened silently as Xavier described discovering a small encampment of mostly elderly Cheyenne and their grandchildren. "I reported their position as ordered, but recommended we approach peacefully. They were hungry, not hostile." His voice grew strained. "Wallace ignored me. He ordered an attack at dawn. I couldn't let it happen." "What did you do?" Grace asked softly. "I warned them, rode ahead in the night, and got them moving before the attack. When Wallace realized what I'd done, he had me arrested for treason." Grace gasped. "Treason? For preventing a massacre of innocents?" "That's not how he saw it. The court-martial was a foregone conclusion. I admitted what I'd done. I was sentenced to 5 years at Fort Leavenworth. But you said the discharge was amended." Xavier nodded. 2 months into my sentence, a congressional investigation into frontier military actions began. Some officers with conscience came forward. My case was reviewed, the sentence commuted, discharge changed to honorable. But by then the damage to your reputation was done." Grace finished for him. "Yes, in some circles, I'm still considered a traitor. That's why I move frequently, work for little. Starting fresh becomes a habit after a while." Grace absorbed his story, understanding now his reluctance to speak of his past and his affinity for the mistreated Stallion. Both had suffered for doing what their natures compelled them to do. "Thank you for telling me," she said finally. "It couldn't have been easy to revisit." Xavier turned to face her fully. "Grace, I should have told you sooner. But I've learned that sharing that story usually ends whatever position or relationship I've begun. People don't want complications." "I'm not people," Grace replied firmly. "I believe you did the honorable thing, whatever a military court decided." Relief crossed his features. Then Harrington didn't turn you against me. He's been asking questions about me in town. James has his own motivations, Grace said dismissively. He's proposed combining our ranches through marriage more than once. A sound business proposition, Xavier observed, though his tone suggested he found the idea distasteful. Perhaps, but I've never wanted a business partner for a husband. Grace met his gaze directly. I'd rather have a partner in every sense, someone who shares my values and stands beside me, not above me. The implication hung between them, neither quite ready to grasp it fully. Xavier reached across the wagon seat and took her gloved hand in his. Grace, I've been thinking about Tempest's training being complete. Her heart sank. Was this his way of saying he would soon leave? You've done a remarkable job, she managed. The thing is, he continued, I don't want to leave. Not the ranch, and especially not you. Hope flared within her. What are you saying, Xavier? I'm saying I've wandered long enough. I've never met anyone like you. Never found a place that felt like it could be home. Until now. His blue eyes held hers intently. I'm asking if there might be a permanent position for me here. As your ranch manager, perhaps. Or, he hesitated, then pressed on. Or as something more, if you could consider a man with my history. Grace felt tears spring to her eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. She blinked them back, unwilling to cloud this moment. Xavier Northrop, are you proposing to me beside a creek in a muddy wagon? A smile broke across his face, transforming its usual seriousness. I suppose I am, though not very elegantly. Good, Grace said firmly. Because I've had elegant proposals before, from men who saw only my property or the novelty of the cattle queen. I'd rather have honesty beside a creek than flattery in a parlor. Is that a yes? Xavier asked, hope evident in his voice. It's a court me properly so the gossips have something real to talk about, and then we'll see, Grace replied with a smile of her own. I'm not opposed to the idea of making you a permanent fixture at Circle K, but I believe in thorough evaluation before major decisions. Xavier laughed, the sound rich and unrestrained. Always the practical businesswoman. Very well, Miss Kincaid. May I have permission to call on you formally, with the intention of courtship? You may, Mr. Northrop, she replied, enjoying the formality while their hands remained intertwined. Though I warn you, I'm considered quite particular. I wouldn't have it any other way. He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. When she didn't, he kissed her, a gentle, questioning kiss that deepened as she responded. When they finally parted, Grace felt a certainty she'd never experienced before. Whatever challenges lay ahead, from nosy neighbors or Xavier's past, they would face them together. Like Tempest, they had both found someone who saw past their defenses to the strength beneath. Xavier picked up the reins and clicked to the horses. As they continued toward home, for it was truly home now for both of them, the setting sun painted the valley in gold, promising a future as bright as the Montana sky was wide. Spring 1890, the apple blossoms drifted like snow across the ranch yard as Grace Kincaid Northrop watched her husband leading a spirited 2-year-old colt through its first lesson. Seated on the porch steps, she smiled as Xavier demonstrated the same patience that had won Tempest's trust and her heart the previous year. Their December wedding had been the social event of the season, drawing curiosity seekers from as far as Missoula. Some came expecting scandal, given the brevity of their courtship, but found instead a celebration of genuine affection blessed by even the most skeptical community members. Mrs. Collins had cried openly during the ceremony, later telling Grace that her father would have been proud of her choice. Tempest stood regally in the nearby paddock, watching the training session with interest. The stallion had sired 3 foals already, passing on his magnificent conformation and intelligence. Under Xavier's guidance, the Circle K was developing a reputation for exceptional horses alongside its prize cattle. He has your touch, Grace called as Xavier released the colt to run free in the corral. Xavier crossed to join her, removing his hat as he sat beside her on the steps. He's a quick learner. Like his grandsire. He nodded toward Tempest. Grace leaned against her husband's shoulder, content in a way she'd never imagined possible. Their partnership had proven even more successful than she'd hoped, with Xavier bringing new perspectives to ranch operations while respecting the traditions she valued. The neighboring ranchers, including Harrington, had gradually accepted Xavier's presence, particularly after he organized a cooperative effort during February's blizzard that saved cattle across 3 properties. His past remained a topic of occasional gossip, but most people now judged him by his present actions rather than distant rumors. Henry says the North pasture is ready for the first herd, Grace noted. The rotation system is working better than expected. Your innovation, Xavier reminded her. I just helped implement it. Our innovation now, she corrected, taking his hand. Everything is ours now. Xavier smiled and brought her hand to his lips. Including the future, he said, his gaze dropping briefly to her still flat stomach. They had shared the news with only Mrs. Collins so far. A child would arrive by late autumn, a new generation for the Circle K. Grace felt Xavier's wonder matched her own. Neither had expected this particular blessing so soon. I've been thinking, Xavier said, about expanding the horse breeding program. With Tempest Line proving so successful, we could dedicate the west section entirely to that operation. Grace nodded thoughtfully. A sound diversification. The Army is always looking for quality mounts, and the railroad's expansion means more demand for carriage horses in the cities. They continued discussing plans for the ranch's future as the spring evenings settled around them. From humble beginnings, a struggling female rancher and a wandering horse trainer with a complicated past, they had forged something remarkable together. As darkness fell and they prepared to head inside, Xavier paused, looking out over the property that had become truly his home. You know, he said quietly, when you dared me to train that wild stallion, I never imagined where it would lead. Grace smiled up at her husband. I knew exactly where I hoped it would lead. I just wasn't sure you were trainable. Xavier laughed and swept her into his arms, carrying her up the porch steps. Fortunately, the cattle queen is as skilled with stubborn men as she is with her herds. And fortunately, Grace replied, kissing him, this particular stubborn man was worth every moment of the training. Together they entered their home, secure in the knowledge that what had begun as a professional challenge had transformed into a love as vast as the Montana sky and as enduring as the mountains that watched over their thriving ranch.